Thank you for joining us. I am Drew Armstrong, the executive editor of Endpoints News, and welcome to Post Talk Live. Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Post Talk Live. I'm Drew Armstrong. I'm the executive editor of Endpoints News. I'm going to be your host today. Now, I got my start about 20 years ago in journalism as a reporter in Washington. And today we are going to be talking about the news in DC as pharma, biotech, investors, and government all try to figure out what to do about the rise of China biotech. If you are joining us for the first time, hello. Post Talk Live brings you the reporting, the analysis, and the debate that usually happens behind the scenes in our newsroom live to you. If you're joining us on YouTube, not already following us, make sure you hit that little subscribe button below our feed to get alerts about future live streams. You can also sign up for the Post Hoc email on your Endpoints News subscription page. Joining us today is our own Max Bayer, who is focusing on the China biotech story in Washington. We're also delighted to welcome Anna Puglisi, the National Counterintelligence Officer for East Asia in the former National Counterintelligence Officer and a former Senior Policy Advisor for Biotechnology at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. She's now the founder of Beyond Cold War Consulting. We also have John Stanford, the Executive Director of the Biotech Trade Group Incubate Coalition, who's been spending a lot of time in Washington on this issue. We will hear about that in a second. Now, for those of you who are joining on YouTube today, you can join us with a live chat question in the little box to the right of your screen. You can ask us questions. Our producer will feed those over to me. If we get a great one, I'll try to get it to our panel. And if you miss us live, our recordings will live on YouTube as well as on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Welcome to the show, John and Anna. Welcome back. Max, let's get us started. Max, I want to turn to you and John. As I mentioned, this has been Max's beat for the last several months. John, I know you've been closely following this story and engaged with it in some meetings in Washington. Can you guys just help set the table for us? Kind of where are we right now when this conversation started to really, I think, heat up and become more public this year? And where are we going at the current moment? Let me hand it over to you guys for a second. John, we'll go to you first and then turn over to Max.
Well, great to be here, and credit to Endpoints, and especially Max, we're religious reading over here at Incubate, and we're the voice of life science venture capital. So we're trying to explain to Congress the perspective of venture capital. You asked the right question of sort of why now, and I think there's a confluence of two events, and then Max will tell me everything I said wrong. But the first is China's dynamic moment over the last 5 years, where they have moved along the value chain to really be innovative. They're not just the cheap, low-cost place you go for basic science. Their investments are paying off, and they're developing and moving along assets in addition to being faster and cheaper in clinical trial development. So compelling case to go to China. But why is this moment happening now? Is because in last year's defense bill, Congress gave some authorities to regulate innovation in China in certain industries. And so it's the confluence of both this now known issue alongside, we actually have potentially a tool in the toolkit to deal with US-China relations in specific industries. And now we're playing out of, okay, so what do we do and when and how, and is it even going to work? And so that's why I think this moment is happening right now.
Max, we see a lot of different voices in this conversation. I mentioned some of them at the top of our show, but can you kind of lay out the players for us a little bit and who is, who is kind of on which side of the argument right now in this conversation in Washington?
Yeah. So you have, and I'll try and maybe spare some names, but I think generally speaking, you have some investors who are in, and I can sort of explain this sort of in this maybe pro-hawkish camp, or people who are maybe pro adding biotech to this outbound investment list. That was the discretion given that John described in the defense bill. You also have people who are maybe more in the federal national security apparatus, who I think have been watching China's biotech ascension. I think Anna can get into this. with some nervousness, whether that's from a supply chain standpoint, like APIs and key starting materials, which has been a discussion for a while, to actual drug manufacturers, as the Biosecure Act outlined, and then now to actual drug makers themselves. And then you have the other camp of people who don't dispel that concern, but I think are much more hesitant and are pushing back against restrictions as the means for limiting them. And that's largely the big pharma companies who have capitalized off of Chinese innovation now for years and are increasingly doing so. And I can kind of spit out some of the latest numbers there, which are really kind of jaw dropping. And also major biotech investors who have made, frankly, good business out of joint ventures, US spin out co's with some early assets in China that develop or have proof of concept data.
Anna, will you talk to us a little bit? I mean, you mentioned just before the show, I think a lot of people started just paying attention to this story maybe at the end of last year, or maybe the beginning of 2025, when I think it kind of broke out into a much more public conversation. But I know this is something you've been paying attention to for a while. Can you talk about, I think, just your roles in government and how this issue has evolved in prominence over that time? I think this is a good way of kind of explaining your background and also your thinking on China biotech.
Sure. Yeah, at first, it's great to be here, and what an important topic and moment in time to be talking about this, especially with both of you out at the big conference. But, I think, what this really highlights is how the geopolitical battle space has really changed. Right? And I laugh about, with my company, I call it Beyond Cold War Consulting, because it's we face a really different playing field now than we did. And I think a lot of different technology areas, we understand why chips matter in a national security perspective. We understand quantum and all those other, but it's really kind of new to think about biotech in that way. And I think what we've really seen, and it's truly amazing, and I think John highlights that very well, is China's made crazy investments over the last 2 decades to really grow their biotech industry. They've put in place the building blocks. They've moved up the value chain. It's technical infrastructure. It's human capital. It's a regulatory environment that moves fast. And those are all the essence of science is collaboration. However, I think what's really important to remember is that China is a very different system, and that is because it blurs public and private, civilian and military, and the role of the state in even in commerce and in a lot of these areas. And so you see the emergence of national champions, you see support and and a number of laws that have been put in place that really kind of skew the playing field. And it really begs the question, do we really want to be dependent on a strategic competitor at best for not only things like APIs and KSMs, but increasingly the development cycle of advanced biotech?
Can you? I think something I would like to. I feel like I have a lot of conversations with people on this. Is this relationship between the state and between the corporate world in China? And I'm wondering if you can spend a little bit of time explaining that relationship. I think it's often thought that oh, they're one and the same, and so on and so forth. And I suspect that that's maybe a little bit more simplistic view than reality, and in particular to biotech, where, yes, there's a lot of state support, but it's not like this is a long-standing state-owned enterprise or something like that. Can you explain kind of how those relationships tend to work and the right way of thinking about them, particularly as it pertains to biotech, where we have a lot of startups and smaller companies where a lot of this relationship between the US and China is happening?
Right. Yeah. And that's an excellent point, because I think it's really hard. It's very nuanced, right? And you hear really extreme views of, oh, well, there are no private companies, or everything's owned or controlled by the state. But I think we can't downplay the importance of, the ecosystem that these entities exist in. And, China just takes a much more holistic approach to developing not only biotech, but and also in other areas. And so, you get a demand signal from the state. First there's a demand signal, and the support, through industrial clusters, through all kinds of, you know, both direct support. You have the venture, you have the guidance funds. But then there's also, the other things. I mean, we see, China putting in place laws that, basically state that they can compel any entity to share information, regardless of who owns that IP. You see the restriction on genomic data. You see market access issues. And so this really creates an uneven playing field. And it's not, we do have companies here that work with the government, but they can always say no, right? And so there's really the question of how much the state permeates society, and this has only grown even more undersheet.
You brought up something that I feel like Max and I have talked about a number of times, and I suspect, John, this is a conversation that companies and investors in your orbit have had, which is, if you are working with a partner in China, how safe is the information you have, and is the state going so far as to say, okay, we're going to kind of do, we're going to steal secrets on your behalf and help you get ahead. And I'm sure this happens all around the globe with governments, but what is there've been a number of cases that I think, thin on details, where people have said a US based company invented something, and, maybe some of those trade secrets or inventions then popped up in China. How real is that risk? I mean, can you explain, to the extent that you're able, how we should think about the kind of the government assistance around, secrets and trade practices and things like that happens there?
Sure. I certainly can't quantify it. But I do sometimes find that perception of China to be a little outdated. They are developing small molecules, cell and gene therapies, biologics, you name it, in an innovative way now. And while, yes, IP theft by China over the years has been a longstanding talking point, the reality is, over here on the US side, we have an open society. After you have found your innovation and you get your paperwork in the right way, we tell the world how you did it. It's actually one of the fundamentals of how we move things along. And so this notion that there is a top secret set of data at an emerging biotech in the US that China is prying into with a crowbar, I think is a little misguided, because that biotech is announcing what it's doing to the world and relying on the rule of law to defend its innovation over the rest of that patent period. I think what maybe is probably more concerning to the China hawks is we have a true competitor. And Anna laid out great points, but as she was saying it, there are so many differences between the US and China. We don't need to dwell there. But a lot of what she laid out was our very own roadmap over the last 40 years. You talk about government subsidy of research. This is why Incubate champions NIH. And something I run into every once in a while is, well, is our ecosystem going to fall apart in the US? If China gets so far ahead and develops supremacy, is it going to fall apart in the US? Not if we don't let it. If we keep an NIH funding at, let's call it 40 billion, 50 billion, you've got US venture capital pouring in another 20 to 40 billion, and then you've got manufacturers acquiring. And when they do those acquisitions, even if they're acquiring from abroad, 80, 90% of the retained value stays in the US. We're not going to wither on the vine if we nurture the US ecosystem. I think what makes this conversation so uncomfortable for everyone is China has nurtured its ecosystem. It is blooming, and we have not. We have made every possible wrong choice we can make over the last decade from a policy standpoint to say that Kendall Square is where it all needs to happen, and RTP in North Carolina and out in California, which is hosting Bio this week. We've turned our back on the US biotech ecosystem on both sides of the aisle in many ways That's where the conversation has got to get back to. I think some of this "we're going to rein in China" is just a missed way of thinking about it. China took our playbook, pour money into it, show that the government will be there for it, build out the corporate value chain so that you develop expertise, send the best and brightest around the world to learn and bring them home. Like everything from our workforce, immigration, and of course our biotech policy needs to be reframed so that we can be competitive. But I think this idea that China's just stealing our secrets and monetizing them, to me, feels very outdated.
Can
Can
I?
I
Well,
just wanna,
actually, I really, if that's how that came across, that really wasn't my intention because,
Oh no, Anna, I'm not.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
responding to Drew's question. I
Oh,
don't
okay,
think
yeah,
that's what
'cause,
you
Well,
were
I
saying.
did
I'm
want I did
you
want
responding.
laid
Anna to
out,
weigh in there because
yeah,
I am curious to get her
'cause
perspective
you
on the
really,
IP
yeah.
theft
I mean,
issue. Yeah.
I've, I'm on the record saying this. You can't protect what you don't have, right? And so it's so important what you laid out. Um, we have a choice. We need to compete, and those are all the things that we need to compete. However, I think it's antiquated to ignore that comparative advantage only works when everyone's getting along, right? And so if China was a neutral actor, we could say, hey, great, you know what? We can just, collaborate with everybody across the board and regardless of where you are. But I think what hasn't changed, China's become more innovative. And I've written about this a really long time. It's because of all those investments. But we still see the policies and programs, of a nation state that doesn't treat or that pulls in all of the, it creates a system that where the state still has a huge influence. And so that, regardless of how well we want to invest or collaborate, kind of puts the finger on the scale and really puts our small companies and it's something that they're being stolen, but basically puts them up against the nation state. So Max, I interrupted you. So.
No, you're totally fine.
Yeah.
John, you say something real quick. I got it, and then I'm gonna
Well,
yeah.
I just want to say that comparative advantage is only going to grow when data plays a bigger and bigger role in AI-enabled whatever. I'm a little bit of a skeptic on AI-enabled drugs tomorrow, but AI-enabled clinical trials, who is ripe for this? That centralization that Anna speaks about, that power of the state that frankly we don't see in the US, is going to be a competitive advantage when they can say, every hospital, you are going to tell us every possible detail, and we're going to let AI spit out who's ripe for this. That's how drug development speeds along in a fast way. We should be working overtime in the US to align our policies for that environment. And it's not just China. Think about the NHS in the UK, the advantages they're going to have that they sit on a repository of data that biotechs are going to have to beg Optum for, United Healthcare, or state insurance commissioners. That's where this competitive advantage is really going to take off, and it will be unfair. And one of the reasons that this is also so thorny of an issue is, do we want drugs globally coming along fastest? And at what cost are we willing to let China take the full advantage of being a nation state that polices its people and there is no data protection and there may not be, in many places, rule of law? These are thorny issues. So when I meet someone on this issue who says it's black or it's white, this is tough stuff, and it's geopolitical, and it's supra to our own industry. So Max, with that, I interrupted you.
Well, I wanted to go back to the point that you had sort of made about the push from Incubate and many others about the policies to invigorate or reinvigorate the US system, because being here at Bio 2 years ago was when Bio, the org, essentially sort of changed its position on the Biosecure Act, which maybe many people could think of as almost the precursor to this. And at the time, Bio did that in part to sort of get a sunset period built in, and also to maybe get some additional investments. And some of that happened and some of it didn't. Oh, John, are you back?
It kicked me out. Clearly, I said something that Chinese were not okay with, and they were like, "He's gone."
All right.
Max,
well, I
I'm
was
sorry
basically
about
I
that.
was basically sort of based off of your points, I was just reminded that when the Biosecure was being negotiated, Bio changed its position in part to get things that would help the industry. One of them was a sunset period, but there were also, I think, billions of dollars in investments that they had asked for that I don't think ultimately came to fruition. And so I wonder what conversations you've had and if you feel a little bit more optimism that that might be paired with any kind of restrictions on business development. Like, do you actually think that lawmakers or folks in the admin are also interested in sort of like pro-growth policies in the US, or might those stall out like we've kind of seen in other negotiations?
Yeah, I'll give you 2 data points why I'm optimistic, but
Yeah.
I also am in policy, so I have to be optimistic. Otherwise I'd get a new job. The FDA's congressional budget justification had some proposals that they want to see to move the FDA forward.
Yeah.
Great stuff. And it mirrors a lot or some of what is in Congressman Auchincloss's plan that he's laid out a great FDA reform. So the fact that the Trump administration and Congressman Auchincloss can put out mutual ideas about FDA modernization tells me that there could be something there. The problem is FDA reform is a heck of a lot less sexy than what do we do with China?
Right.
And what we hope at Incubate is that this moment of intensity in our industry, and this divides I've heard every perspective under the sun from investors on this, of what the right course forward is. My hope is that this scrutiny could elevate the sexiness of FDA reforms.
Yeah.
I think it's a big question mark if some of these things would even work in China. I mean, I think the idea that we wall off China is a fallacy. I don't think there's one magic lever that takes us back in time to the dominance of the 2000s and 2010s. Instead, I think we've got to up our game in a really compelling way. That's what I hope we get out of this moment. But Anna made some great point. Like, securing APIs, that's a no-brainer. Like,
Right.
there are things we absolutely must do. Protecting American genomic data from nation-state actors, absolutely must do. But I think when it comes to should biotechs be able to do trials elsewhere in the world, I think those are things we work through. But everyone on both sides of the aisle needs to see, hey, we've let ourselves languish. Our FDA is not prepared for the 2030s. Let's focus on that. And I'm hopeful that policymakers are now there and ready to listen.
Max,
Right. I think, I was going to say, I think a lot of, the recommendations from the Bio Commission are really spot on for that. And I think really what it highlights is we need a strategy, because we haven't had a strategy. And as far as, thinking through what is that technical infrastructure? What are those things that no one company is going to do but are essential for the industries? And to really foster that and make it really clear that this is a priority. I couldn't agree more, because I think in a lot of ways that's what we need. And of course, regulatory reform is never a sexy thing, but it's so important, right? But also, I think recognizing that, all places should be held to the same standards and have the same amount of unannounced inspections. And that doesn't always happen. So I mean, that's a good place to start, that we hold to the same standards.
Anna, can you mentioned, and I feel like this is a conversation I've had with a lot of folks, that we need a strategy and we don't have a strategy.
Mhm.
Are there industrial and technology areas where you feel like we do have a very strong strategy here in the United States, either by kind of like legacy happenstance, as sometimes happens, or by really careful choices that we've made? How does put biotech, I think there are a lot of maybe too facile comparisons that get, a biotech versus cars or semiconductors, and these are very different industries. So where does, the strategy
Mhm.
in other industries kind of compare in terms of, or is biotech a stepchild, or are we just seeing kind of the consequences of not really having a deep industrial strategy in a lot of places?
Great. That's a great question. It's been so interesting watching kind of the evolution here in DC in the discussion of, I put industrial policy, right? Because we're an open
It wasn't
market
a phrase
economy.
you
We don't
heard a
have
lot
one.
that,
Right.
until we had a real serious competitor.
But I think John said it best, right? Like, in some ways, we've forgotten our own history. and China has used that same blueprint or that game plan to build not only in biotech. I mean, we've seen this before across a whole host of other industries in the way, they really kind of moved up the value chain. And so I think, chips and science and some of these other policies are a start. But we're still, we don't have a Ministry of Science and Technology. We don't have very similar, kind of infrastructure that can really set, beginning to set, okay, what direction should we go in? And so I'm encouraged by, suddenly we're okay with talking about, okay, maybe we do need an industrial policy, and that's not the same. I mean, it's not telling everybody how to do things or picking winners. It's basically putting in place the conditions and creating an ecosystem where we support domestic industry. We ensure that our biotech industry is healthy and advancing, and that we can protect our citizens and make sure that they get the medicines and other things that biotech is going to be able to make.
Max, you had a scoop, last week, I think, talking about this Treasury looking at some potential rules around U.S. outbound investment that I thought was very interesting. Tell us about that story. And then, and that was kind of a bit of a prompt for this conversation. I think, looking at saying, wait a second, we're seeing more of these barriers get considered, and let's talk about what they mean. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that scoop?
Sure. So, to some of what John mentioned at the beginning, basically a lot of, I think, where this discussion has amplified itself is in the prospect of the government placing express restrictions on what companies in the US can invest in China. And the law that John was referencing specifically named semiconductors and industries that I think have much more of a defense angle and focus. But it gave Treasury discretion to add to that list. So there has been specific lobbying by some in industry to include biotech in that list so that it would effectively either be more onerous to make investments in China biotechs for new drugs or through joint ventures or equity financings potentially, that would then need to be reviewed by the Treasury. And in some instances, they might be, completely revoked by the government. So that was the power given to Treasury in that bill. You've since seen lawmakers John Molinar and Debbie Dingell, a bipartisan group of Michigan lawmakers, come out with their own bill, which was probably the most hawkish language, like kind of a worst case scenario for industry, I suppose, if that sort of gained momentum. And I'm not exactly sure. I would be surprised if maybe Treasury took that exact stance. But we reported on what Treasury is thinking about in conversations that they've had with different people on industry. And what was gleaned to me through a number of conversations with different people was that they're looking at it, and people who had spoken with Treasury relatively recently feel it's pretty likely that biotech is included in these regulations that they have the power to make in some form. Now, the interesting thing, and this is sort of minutia rulemaking, so I'll go swift so I don't bore people, but basically you have to come out with a draft rule, and then there's a public comment period where often on something like this, industry would comment ad nauseum. You might see an incubate comment on that rule. You might see a pharma and a bio comment on that rule. You might see an individual investor, an individual company. The whole kit and caboodle, I think, will be coming out if this does in fact happen. Then a final rule maybe includes some of that public comment and distills it into something that, is better for everybody, just to sort of paint a rosy picture potentially. So we were reporting on that process and those conversations and what, industry might expect in the coming weeks or months from Treasury about this potential limiting on outbound investments.
John, what's the biotech investment community think of stuff like this? I mean, I think we've seen, two really interesting dynamics. One, which is, a lot of biotech investors have, taken advantage of technology, molecules being developed in China to start, new companies or license drugs and build startups for the rest of the globe. And then we've also seen a lot of, big pharma companies go out and announce, huge licensing deals, which I think some people, look at as saying, well, I wish you were, buying these drugs from, US and European biotechs. But what does the biotech investment community think about, the rules like what Max is discussing?
Well, I think if you've asked one investor's opinion on China and biotech, you get one investor's opinion on China and biotech. Because there are so many variables there, and in our conversation with policymakers, I mean, I think that's our point. This would be a very hard environment to propose rules around or put a reg in place. And good luck to the great teams at Treasury as they navigate this for every technology that's covered. I think there's differences of opinions here. And I think ultimately, one thing that does unite everyone is at the end of the day, there's a patient here. And I think we're having tough conversations of, is the patient best served if we go and take something out of China? If that leads to a long-term weakening of US biotech, are we okay with that trade? And it's a trade-off. The wider the door is open to China, it's sort of economics 101. And it's not just China. I think and this is what I push people to think about. Are we interested in a US only ecosystem, which would do very well? We've got brilliant minds, plenty of capital, patients who need it. Or are we a globalized biotech ecosystem? And if we're globalized, how, to Anna's point, do we develop rules of the road that keep it in some sort of fair balance? And so I don't think there is a unified position. What I do think is unified is a skepticism that there's a silver bullet here. And I don't think there's a silver bullet. I don't think we understand how this would go out in practice. If we have notification and disclosure requirements, that's part of the Coins Act, and they only pick certain modalities, does that mean we just stop investing in those modalities? We jump to some other modalities that don't have notification and disclosure? But does it really make sense to put a small molecule that I can get off the shelf anywhere, but happen to get developed in China first? Are we really saying we're not interested in that? There are 600 variations on that, so I hate to give you a totally crappy answer of, you get 600 different answers. And that's what we're navigating as an ecosystem. But the through line is, we have to take our US biotech ecosystem more seriously. It has to get the love and TLC that it needs through FDA reforms, from turning around on MFN. I mean, MFN would only further catalyze this isolationism. So we have to say no to bad policies, embrace good policies, and then continue thinking about how our China relationship evolves.
Yeah.
I want to ask Anna something real quick, because I think this is sort of getting to a little bit to sort of the nuances here. From a national security perspective, is there a hierarchy to some degree about the big pharma kind of deals that include maybe, co-collaboration and co-development, as opposed to some of this spin out work? Like, do you think all of this maybe is of equal national security concern, or there's something that maybe a group like Incubate, or is there something that maybe Treasury or the national security teams are more concerned about than others in the deal making?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to follow up on what John said, that this is so nuanced, right? And we need scalpels, not sledgehammers, when we're making these policies. But I think at the end of the day, when we think through, like, what is it going to take to sustain, the biotech industry here in the U.S. And I think, there's a difference between collaborating with, a multitude of other countries, our allies, partners, like-mindeds. And the concern is, I mean, we look at rare earths, right? I mean, the restrictions put on rare earths. If you put restrictions like that on medicine, and a lot of people will say, oh, well, no, that would never happen. I think we have to think that might happen. And so, again, thinking through, this is not, if you don't have a chip or you don't have a rare earth, that's terrible. But it's not as terrible as if we can't make some basic medicines and those are used as political leverage. And so I think, thinking through, where are those, key investments and policies that ensure that, at the end of the day, we can provide those kinds of things for our citizens and our, and our allies.
Yeah.
John and Anna, I want to wrap up by, the the question that we started this with, which was the oversimplified, are the China hawks winning? But I do want you to take a few seconds each and kind of assess the state of the conversation right now, where I think I've kind of divided the world up into the, one group of folks who believe, keep everything open and keep doing things the way we're doing now. Another group of folks who are saying we need more restrictions and barriers. And another set of ideas around, I think changing things here or having a more global industry that kind of takes the best and fastest parts of China and keeps what we have here. It seems to me like at the present time, the loudest voices that we see, in conversation and showing up public, or have really been the crowd arguing for more restrictions. I think the conversation is happening at a lot of different levels. I think there are a lot of people who are not speaking in public, but who are speaking in private. But where do you all see the conversation going right now? Who do you think is getting heard? And what do you think the risks in the moment we have are right now in the choices we have to make? John, I'll go to you first, and then I'll turn to Anna for the last word.
I was really hoping you go to Anna first. That's a good question.
I won that one.
I'm going to try to go in reverse order. The biggest risk, absolute biggest risk, is that in an effort to satiate China hawks, we fail to act on U.S. basics. Fund NIH, protect intellectual property, enable the free market to succeed for venture-backed companies to come forward, maintain clear rule of law, value medicine as it comes out. My fear is that we do something on China, and so the itch is scratched. And now people don't take FDA reform seriously. Because if you want, we're in an election year, and if you want the headline at home that Joe is tough on China, and so therefore they push, an anti-China biotech bill or push the administration to do this, the most helpful thing we can do is give our US scientists a signal that you are valued here, you are wanted here, and we are going to fund the basic research that gives us a head start. So that the biggest existential risk is that we don't use this moment to do much needed modernizations. Do I think the China hawks are winning? I think everyone is doing a good job raising the understanding that China has caught us in the biotech race, and we are neck and neck. Who the next 10 years belongs to, next 20 years belongs to, probably depends on how the next 3 to 5 years of policymaking go. So I think they're winning in the sense of, I think people are aware now that this is an issue. I'm not sure I'd say that people are locked in one of those camps. I think people in power know this is a conversation that requires a lot of nuance.
Well, Anna, you have the advantage of a minute or two extra to think, but John also got first dibs on any low-hanging fruit. So we'll turn to you for the final word.
So yeah, it's so funny. I think especially when I looked at the title today, I was like, we have to decide, what does winning look like, right? Because I think we haven't defined that, and I think talking about the challenges, of the Chinese system, not just in biotech, but across a whole swath of different technology areas, and acknowledging, where those systems differ, our system, and not only ours, but our, allies like-minded. That's an important part of the conversation to have, right? And I'm going to just double foot stomp, what John said about, we can't protect what we don't have. We need to make those key investments. We need to stop shooting ourselves in the foot and cutting, this key, because I think we're in the biotech is going to determine the investments we make now or we don't, right, will impact the next 5 or 10 years. And that first mover advantage, we're in a race from genotype to phenotype, and whoever gets there first there's no going back. That's, that comparative advantage. And so, but I think I would hope that the investment community and companies realize that we're not dealing with a neutral actor. Right? And while it may, in similar vein to other industries who, it was great until it wasn't, we need policies for the China we have, not the one we want. So, but with that, I think, I'm so Team Hawk or whatever, I'm Team Biotech. I think we need to really double down on those and make it the priority that it really is.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. But as I mentioned, when we were chatting privately ahead of the show, I do think this is the most important story in biotech right now, and we'll be following this closely. We'll be continuing this conversation. You can keep up with our coverage at endpoints.news or by subscribing to our newsletters. John and Anna, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a pleasure to have you in conversation. Hope we keep talking. Max, thanks for joining us again. The recording of this conversation will live on YouTube. The audio will be up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you are already signed up for our Post Hoc newsletter, you'll get notifications when we have a new broadcast coming up. If you're not signed up, head over to endpoints.news. In the top right-hand corner, hit your little reader profile link, and then you can navigate through there to get on the newsletter list. You'll get us every time we have a new show. You can also follow us on X, LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and Blue Sky by searching Endpoints News. A huge thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, and our engineer, Dalen Turk. I am Drew Armstrong, your host and the executive editor of Endpoints News. This is Post Hoc Live, and we will see you the next time news breaks.